Well, thank you all so much for joining us for a visit with the Boston African American National Historic Site. During the years preceding the American Civil War, Boston served as one of the most important stops on the Underground Railroad. Did you know that many of the fugitives escaping from enslavement came to Boston by stowing away on ships from southern ports? We're going to explore the untold stories of men and women making daring escapes to freedom through the Boston Harbor. And today's presentation is led by National Park Ranger Shawn Quigley. So all 100 of us or so who are watching live, and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Shawn for joining us this afternoon. And Shawn, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Robert. And thanks to everyone who took some time out of their Tuesday to come learn a little bit about the Maritime Underground Railroad. So what I'm going to do now is I'll share my screen and we can get started. All right. So again, thanks everyone for taking the time here today. So as Robert said, over roughly the next 35 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about something that may not be as familiar. Definitely was not to me, except for, kind of some in more recent years due to some studying and exploration and into this topic. But we'll be talking about not only the Underground Railroad, but more specifically the maritime aspects of the Underground Railroad right here in the city of Boston. So what you're looking at right now is a painting done by a man named Henry Fitzlane, and it is an image of Boston Harbor in the mid-19th century, so 1840s, 1850s. And this image is not the image that I know that I had in mind when I first started working for the National Park Service and thought about the Underground Railroad. When the Underground Railroad came to mind, when I heard the term, what was more familiar to me and what I associated with the Underground Railroad was more an image like this one. Harriet Tubman, leading enslaved people to their freedom, traveling at night, through the woods, going to safe houses, following the North Star. A lot of mythology associated with the Underground Railroad. I never really thought about the harbor. I never thought about ships, the ocean. But, the Underground Railroad, the image, the mythology of the Underground Railroad you see here, I think it's something that is almost similar to Paul Revere's ride, in the sense that it's woven into the fabric of American mythology to the point that we know that it happened, but it almost doesn't seem real. Well, the Underground Railroad was not only very real, but also that maritime aspect of the Underground Railroad. Now, many enslaved individuals would go by any means necessary to escape the institution of slavery, travel on this Underground Railroad. The people who are using these overland routes, who are going through the woods, they're often doing it at border states, places like Kentucky, where you can cross the Ohio River into a free state. But for enslaved people who are on the coast, especially further south along the East Coast, say in Wilmington, North Carolina, or Norfolk, Virginia, the easiest way for someone to escape would actually likely be via ship, getting on board a vessel and heading north to a port city and also to freedom. This was something that appeared in newspapers, accounts, and as you'll see throughout the next 30 or so minutes, a series of stories that really unpacks this aspect of the Underground Railroad and was one, again, that I personally was not as aware of until I was shared a story that I will tell in a moment. But as one newspaper in Wilmington, North Carolina wrote, it is almost an everyday occurrence for our slaves to take passage aboard a ship and go north, and that the Underground Railroad through the harbor was an evil which was getting to be intolerable. Now, that's a newspaper in Wilmington, North Carolina, in the mid-1800s. One of the escapes that this newspaper might have been describing is a story I'll share next, and is a story that really sparked my interest in this subject and kind of sent me down this rabbit hole that uncovered a lot of aspects of the Underground Railroad in Boston that I did not know. So if anybody here has been to the Boston Harbor Islands, more specifically Spectacle Island. As you can see here, this is the image of Spectacle Island looking out towards Boston from the North Drum, which is the highest point in Boston Harbor. Now today, Boston Harbor Islands, especially Spectacle Island, offer a lot of recreational opportunities. But in the 1840s, this was the location of a sensationalized escape of a man from enslavement in New Orleans. So in September of 1846, the Ottoman, a ship that had escaped from a ship that came from New Orleans, was captained by a man named James Hannum. Now, the ship, while in Boston Harbor, Hannum discovered that he had a stowaway on board, a man named George. Hannum was determined to return George to the institution of slavery. But the weather was not favorable, and he could not leave Boston Harbor. So what Hannum decided to do, while he was waiting for better weather, was actually to head to Spectacle Island. This is a newspaper account from James Hannum talking about this episode. Hannum wanted to stop at Spectacle Island to, as he said, get a drop of consolation. You might be a little surprised to hear this, but in the mid-1800s, Spectacle Island was home to 2 hotels. So Captain Hannum wanted to stop at Spectacle Island Hotel, specifically the hotel bar, to get a drink. He brought with him George in a small group. But while Hannum's at the hotel bar getting his drink, George will steal Hannum's small rowboat and take off for South Boston. Hannum quickly realizes what has occurred, takes another boat, and a foot race ensues in South Boston, going over fields, fences, and finally, George is going to be apprehended at a bridge. Hannum says he's wanted for robbery, but soon word spreads that that was false and that George was actually a freedom seeker, someone who had escaped the institution of slavery and had been recaptured by Hannum. Now, word spread quickly amongst these anti-slavery circles, and Hannum knew that he was running out of time to get George out of Boston. So what Hannum ends up doing is he will find a captain of another boat that is heading to New Orleans. It's a ship called the Niagara. Hannum knows that he has to get George out of Boston if he wants to send him back to the institution of slavery. So he gets him on board this ship. He's out in the outer harbor, so kind of near where Boston Light and Tasket Beach, in that area. And as he has transferred George over, he looks up and he sees a ship quickly coming for him. It's a ship full of abolitionists, white and black. And as Hannum described it, they were armed and they had, and I quote, bayonets glistening. Hannum knew that this one boat could only follow either his or the Niagara, so he quickly pivots away from the Niagara. And unfortunately, the abolitionists do give chase to Captain Hannum's boat, the Ottoman. George is returned to the institution of slavery. Now, this does not obviously have the typical happy ending that we think of when we think of the Underground Railroad. And I think what this does highlight is there are plenty of examples of people who did make that attempt to escape, and unfortunately were unsuccessful. But what I think that this also highlights is 3 important things that I want to really use to unpack this story and talk about different aspects of the Maritime Underground Railroad. First, I think what this story speaks to is the resolve of ship captains who had commercial interests, traded up and down the East Coast, business partnerships in the South, how determined that they were to return individuals they discovered on board their ships to the institution of slavery. I think what it also speaks to is the resolve of the anti-slavery community that existed here in Boston. As I said at the beginning, I work at Boston African American National Historic Site, which highlights and showcases the North Slope of Beacon Hill community, where Boston's free Black community resided in the decades before the American Civil War. Small, tight-knit group of individuals, only made up 1.5% of the city's entire population, but were crucial, instrumental leaders in a social revolution that took place in this country and right here in this city in the decades leading up to the Civil War. And this community is going to be not only a hotbed of anti-slavery activity, but also Underground Railroad activity, resistance to the slave power, fugitive slave law. It's right here in the city. So this is a community that is going to do everything in their power to try to help people escaping. But what I think is the most important thing that this story on George's Island on Spectacle Island highlights is the agency, willingness, bravery, courage of the individuals escaping the institution of slavery. They're leaving everything, risking everything, to go to a place they do not know to try to take those first steps into freedom. So what I want to do is look at different aspects of the Maritime Underground Railroad through the sense of a journey, coming from the South, coming to Boston, what you found when here in the city. So what you're looking at right now is actually a sketch of New Orleans in the lead up to the American Civil War. And as you can see here by this image, this is a bustling, busy port. Ships are coming and going. Then some are docked, some are leaving, some are coming in. You can imagine all the workers, the sounds, the smells, the goods that are being exchanged. This is a space that creates an opportunity, because there are going to be enslaved people who are going to be working the docks, working on ships, working in these cities, working in a New Orleans, a Wilmington, North Carolina, a Norfolk, Virginia. And what it does, as one historian did say, was talking about the maritime culture. And he said the maritime culture provided runaways a complex network of informants, messengers, go-betweens, and other potential collaborators. Working in these docks, working amongst these ships, you can quickly decipher and learn where they're coming from, where they're going. Is there a sympathetic ship captain on board? Is this crew sympathetic to abolitionists? Are there free Black sailors on board that might be willing to help someone who's enslaved in one of these ports? It's a strong network. It's invaluable information, and it's also an opportunity. It's the quickest way to get from one of these further southern ports to a place like Boston. For example, I know I've mentioned Norfolk, Virginia a couple of times, and I'll come back to that, as well as Wilmington. Norfolk, Virginia is 567 miles away from Boston. It's going to be very difficult to try to walk through slave states in order to get to a free state and not be caught. But if you were able to sneak on board of a vessel in Norfolk, Virginia, if the weather is good, you'd be in Boston in 4 days in the 1850s. Now, there's obviously going to be risks present, but when weighing your options, this could be the best option. Now, how did enslaved people get on board these vessels? Once, they learned the information, know that there's, say, a ship that's leaving bound for Boston. Well, looking through accounts, records, letters, narratives, memoirs, etc., you see it a couple different ways. You have enslaved people that might find a sympathetic ship captain who is going to allow someone to come on board the vessel. Might find a sympathetic crew. Maybe unbeknownst to the ship captain, but the crew might be able to hide someone on board. Might be able to bribe people, ship captain or crew. In some instances, money talked. Allowed you to get on board. And finally, might just sneak on board yourself. We have instances of that as well, where people, unbeknownst to captain or crew, snuck on board the vessel in the hopes that they would be able to escape when arriving in the city, the destination of that trading vessel. And there's going to be people constantly coming and going because, you know, in the 19th century, the Atlantic Ocean and the Eastern Shore, that is going to be your highway. That is going to be where you have, you know, trains are relatively new, but the ships, the commerce, again, with that constant movement, you have that opportunity. But getting on board these ships, you know, you're not staying in a first-class cabin. You snuck on board yourself, or, you know, you're on board unbeknownst to the captain. Likely going to be staying in small, tight, cramped spaces, carrying what little provisions that you could on your back. You know, there's one instance of a man who escaped and stowed away on a ship by quite literally hollowing out a bale of cotton and staying in that on the journey north. And there's obviously great risk in making this attempt. Bad weather, shipwrecks. And then there's, even if you get out of the harbor, because enslavers do not want their enslaved property to escape, and will go to great lengths in order to prevent successful escapes. This is a sketch from William Still's Underground Railroad book, and as you can see here, Mayor and the police of Norfolk, Virginia, searching a schooner before it even leaves the harbor. There are instances of enslavers smoking out vessels to try to quite literally make people that might be hiding on board the ship come up for air. And then when caught, and when caught, enslaved individuals as well as ship captains operating those vessels could face serious punishments, consequences. Now these two images, they're both photographs. So on the right, you have an image of a man who successfully escaped enslavement by the name of Wilson Chin. And this is a photograph where he is, you know, free at this point, but he's showcasing through, you know, the power of photography, the different tools that enslavers would use to prevent people from escaping. Cruel, inhumane. You look at these, like this collar he's wearing that would have bells on it, these metal brackets for the legs that wouldn't allow you to bend your knee to run. You know, again, these cruel, inhumane punishments. And obviously, if you're enslaved and you're caught, you could be beaten, whipped, be sold further south, separating from family members, friends. The consequences are extremely brutal and grave. You also have here on the left, this is a famous photograph called The Man with the Branded Hand. The man's name is Jonathan Walker. He's a ship captain from the Cape Cod and I believe Harwich, if I'm remembering correctly. And what he does is he is assisting individuals to escape on his ship. He's caught. As you can see here, his hand, he's actually branded SS for slave steal. So consequences were much graver for enslaved individuals, obviously, but, you know, did affect those aiding those individuals as well. But despite all these consequences, people still escaped. People, tens of thousands of people, still made this journey north. And you see it in runaway advertisements, you know, advertisements that would be put in newspapers by enslavers calling for rewards, putting out rewards for, you know, the return of their enslaved property. And oftentimes in those ads, you see text warning masters of ships, saying likely to pretend to be a free sailor. In fact, Frederick Douglass, when he escaped the institution of slavery, he posed as a free sailor. The maritime aspects of the Underground Railroad were critical. And this is one of the many reasons why in 1850, the United States government would pass the Federal Fugitive Slave Law. Now, this is a law that is a part of the Compromise of 1850, which allowed for United States Marshals, government agents, to come into any northern state or territory and essentially kidnap people, re-enslaving them. What the law also stated was that if you were caught harboring an individual inside your home, operating an Underground Railroad safe house, you would spend 6 months in prison, pay a $1,000 fine. $1,000 in 1850 is about roughly $38,000 in today's money. You could also be deputized on the spot. That's what that meant. Is if I was walking around minding my own business, someone came up to me and told me I need to help them, this federal marshal, I need to help this marshal arrest somebody, and I said, I'm not going to do that, I could be arrested for failing to comply with the Fugitive Slave Law. So that naturally is going to scare a lot of people, but what it does not do is deter individuals from continuing that escape and coming to places like Boston. After the Fugitive Slave Law, there is dozens, hundreds of examples. People still making that escape. Still doing it via the Maritime Underground Railroad. And the resolve and willingness of individuals escaping via ship, coming, is inspiring. What you're looking at here is a newspaper talking about, as you can see, an escape of a fugitive slave from a vessel in Boston Harbor, electrifying the city. A man by the name of Philip Smith came from Wilmington, North Carolina, stowed away on board, and was discovered. Now, where he is discovered on board is going to be in an area that is known as the Narrows, which is right next to Lovell's Island and George's Island. Now, it's December, and abolitionists, though, got word that there was a freedom seeker on board a ship who was locked up because the ship captain put Philip Smith under lock and key. The abolitionists tried to board the vessel, but when they did, the ship captain said that Smith was gone. During the middle of the night, Philip Smith picked the lock, ripped up a small plank, and jumped overboard in December, swam from the vessel to Lovell's Island, which you see here, was able to hail a passing ship, make his way into that free black community on the north slope of Beacon Hill, and eventually found his way to Canada, where he remained free for the rest of his life. Colds, December, jumping into the harbor, seizing his freedom. But who was helping Philip Smith? What did Philip Smith find when he arrived into Boston? Well, one of the key organizations that was created actually in the aftermath of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law that would have aided individuals like Smith was the Boston Vigilance Committee. Now, this is the third iteration of the Vigilance Committee. Two previously, one in the 1830s, I believe, and the other in the 1840s, actually created in the aftermath of the failed rescue of George in September of 1846. This organization you can think of as one of the financial backbones of the Underground Railroad in Boston, reimbursing people for harboring individuals inside their homes. And this organization is an interracial group that's fundraising, and as I said, reimbursing people for operating Underground Railroad safe houses. But not just reimbursing them, for harboring individuals, it's for food, clothing, shelter. And we don't really know why they did this, but they did keep meticulous financial records. As you can see on the right, that is the first page of the Vigilance Committee records. They are free and available online. But the records not only help, give us invaluable information about the Underground Railroad in Boston, they also help us understand a little bit more about the maritime aspects of the Underground Railroad. So you're looking at right here, this is a photograph of Austin Bierce, a man who was born in Barnstable, Massachusetts, and would dedicate his life following 1840s, 1850s to fighting within the Boston Vigilance Committee and fighting against the institution of slavery. Now, Bierce, as I said, born in Barnstable, and he is a young man, found work on ships trading up and down the East Coast. And through this, he actually interacts, with Southern states and therefore with the institution of slavery. And he gets a, firsthand, firsthand witness to the atrocities and horrors of the institution of slavery. Now, Bierce writes a memoir called Reminiscences of the Fugitive Slave Law Days. And in that memoir, he talks about how he, through this trade, interacted with enslaved individuals, and how on board one of the ships that he was working as a mate, they actually had enslaved people that were going to be sent to auction, to be sold. And he said in his memoir that it was my business to pull off the hatches and warn them, enslaved individuals, that it was time to separate. The shrieks and cries at these times were enough to make anybody's heart ache. Because of this, I no longer think it right to see these things in silence. I trade no more south of Mason and Dixon's line. Bierce puts his money where his mouth is. As you can see here, he becomes an active participant and member of the Boston Vigilance Committee. This is one page, April of 1851 through June of 1851. As you can see, Bierce's name here appears 5 times. And on the April 28th entry, you can see that it is Austin Bierce for a boat in the harbor. So Austin Bierce used his maritime skills to good use in the fight against slavery. As you can see by this image, this is actually an advertisement taken from William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator newspaper. And within this advertisement, Bierce operates a boat, as you can see, called the Moby Dick, which was used for pleasure parties. You can think of it as fishing excursions in the harbor cruises, kind of modern, equivalent of harbor tourist industry, essentially. That's what he did with the boat by day. But by night, Bierce used the boat to get freedom seekers, stowaways from vessels that were docked in Boston Harbor. Now, he shares a couple of these stories in his reminiscences, but one I do want to share is a story that is, I think kind of highlights again some of the boldness of the Vigilance Committee and Bierce himself. So in September of 1854, Bierce gets word that there is a vessel docked near Castle Island that has a stowaway on board. Now, his information is that the ship captain is going to be willing to give up the stowaway, but Bierce's information is wrong, because when he gets up to the ship captain essentially says, "If you try to board my vessel, I'm going to blow you into eternity." So Bierce regroups and goes to Long Wharf, but it's late at night. He can't find anyone to join him, try to, get a crew to go back to the ship. So what he ends up doing is, according to his memoirs, he fastens a bunch of hats and coats to his vessel to make it the illusion that he is got a big crew. He comes back to the ship and essentially says, "I have returned, hand over the stowaway." The ship captain does so. Bierce's ruse works, brings the man to Long Wharf, sends him into the free black community in the North Slope, and that man makes his way to Canada and to freedom. According to Bierce, the next day, the ship captain puts out a reward ad in the newspapers for the pirates that boarded his vessel the previous evening, looking for information on that case. But the final story that I want to share is coming back to what I talked about at the very beginning, the agency, courage, and bravery of individuals who make that journey and escape. And that story I want to share is the story of a young woman named Elizabeth Blakely. So Elizabeth Blakely, 14, 15 years old, I'm not really sure the exact age, was enslaved in Wilmington, North Carolina. And she had a cruel enslaver, a man named George Davis. Blakely heard that there was a ship bound for Boston. Now, accounts differ whether she stowed away by herself, had help from the crew, but regardless, she gets into this small vessel, small hiding space. And this is a rendition of the hiding space that's actually taken from an early 20th century children's magazine that was an offshoot of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Crisis. Blakely's enslaver is determined and believes that she's on board. He will smoke out the vessel 3 times with tobacco and sulfur, again, trying to make her come up for air. But she doesn't do it. The vessel leaves. Takes a couple weeks to get to Boston, January through February. Cold, freezing, out in the open Atlantic Ocean. But she makes it. Frostbitten, cold, but alive and now free. And in 1849, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society holds a meeting at Faneuil Hall. Lucy Stone, prominent activist, is there. And we'll bring a young Elizabeth Blakely on stage. And we'll ask the audience, is this young girl, is this person a piece of property or a human being? Blakely will live in Boston for a couple more years before, after the Fugitive Slave Law, she'll move, to Connecticut and eventually Canada. Lives in Toronto, then moves back to Boston, lives in Chelsea. Is actually able to come back to Faneuil Hall, 100th anniversary celebration of William Lloyd Garrison's birth in 1906. She dies 80 years old and is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett, Massachusetts. And with Elizabeth Blakely and her story, later, after she had left Boston, Wendell Phillips, prominent anti-slavery activist and leader, will recall that he was talking to Elizabeth about this, about her escape, about when the vessel's being smoked out. And she told him that in her mind, she had 2 choices: liberty or death. Now, Elizabeth's story, again, is one of many. Elizabeth Blakely, Frederick Douglass, Philip Smith, George, countless others. Individuals who risked everything, and despite overwhelming odds, severe and grave consequences, they made that attempt to seize their freedom. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
So folks, let's give Shawn a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. As Shawn said, now is the time to get any questions or comments you may have into the chat or the Q&A. We have none at the moment. We have over 100 people watching, but let's get some questions in for Shawn. And Shawn, while people are getting their questions in, I wanted to ask you, semi-related to everything you just discussed, but what is your interest in the topic and why did you become a National Park Ranger?
Yeah, sure. So I was always fascinated with American history growing up. I came to Boston, we'll be frank, I was, focused on the American Revolution. I went to Suffolk University, and then I had my future boss for the Park Service come into one of my classes and talk about the Park Service. And I didn't know, I'd done a lot of Civil War battlefields when I was younger, but I didn't necessarily know as much about the anti-slavery history. And then when I started working here, I really kind of fell into it, was fascinated by it, connections to modern day. And that was 12 years ago, and I'm still here. So it's it's been a real passion of mine. And then I actually did a stint for a summer out on the Harbor Islands, which is where I get introduced to the story about George on Spectacle.
Great. So let's see. I'm going to tackle the chat first. Sarah says, thank you. Karen says, what were some common routes overland between Boston and Canada? And she was wondering specifically if any went through New Hampshire.
Yeah, so there would have been some that, would have gone through New Hampshire. I think, again, it's kind of, whenever you study the Underground Railroad, it is a little hard in the sense that it wasn't a legal activity. And then, there becomes kind of like the memoirs from the 1880s and 1890s where everyone's grandparent or dad's home, was an Underground Railroad SAFO. So it's kind of like sifting through and figuring out where there are kernels of truth in certain things. But I would say that, through some of the stories that we've looked at, oftentimes people would go kind of to the western part of the state, out to like Worcester, that area, and then make their way up north, whether through New York, Vermont, as well as New Hampshire, and then eventually going into Canada. So it was not necessarily as tight of a network as one might think. It's more of kind of like, okay, you come to Boston. Wendell Phillips is an abolitionist who has connections to someone in Worcester. They're going to give you a letter to get on a train and go to Worcester, where you meet this contact, and then you go to the next contact. And that's kind of like that network aspect. It's very strong within Boston, but then kind of making way north, you're going to see different, connections and community groups that people are going to go to.
I'm muted, sorry. Let's see here. Claudia asks, what percentage of successful escaping slaves used ships instead of land?
Great question. One we often get when we talk about this, and unfortunately, I don't have a very good answer for you for exact percentages because we don't really know how many people successfully escaped via the Underground Railroad, again, being that illegal activity. But what I will say, like within Boston, we think of there's some very famous fugitive slave law cases that occurred in the city. There's the arrest of Anthony Burns, Thomas Sims, Shadrach Minkins. And they all escaped via ship. If you look at those slave runaway advertisements, you are going to see, again, a lot of them saying, masters of ship, beware. And I would say that the percentage wise, where you're seeing escapes coming from depends on where you are geographically. So like if you're looking at that East Coast, I'd say that you're going to get a much higher percentage, especially the further south you head, of more people escaping via ship. Whereas if you head more further, kind of west, where you're on those border states, it's going to be easier for people to escape, by, again, just kind of crossing the border into a free state. A notable person in the community here in Boston was a man named Lewis Hayden. He, his wife, and her young child, Joseph, escaped by crossing from Kentucky over into Ohio, just crossing the Ohio River. So it definitely depended upon where you were geographically. And then there's even a whole, I haven't read it yet, but there's a whole book talking about enslaved individuals escaping by going into Mexico and heading further south in those kind of southern states. So, we think of the Underground Railroad again as that Harriet Tubman, again, escaping via night, but it's really a whole network of people that are, looking to escape and seize their freedom in any way possible. You're muted, Robert, sorry.
Did it again. Tracy asks, can you recommend any reading materials, such as books and articles, and where we can find them? So any recommended reading on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually a whole book that came out kind of simultaneously while I was doing this research, which is actually would have been better if it came out if I was aware of it a little bit earlier, but it's called Sailing to Freedom. I'll drop it in the chat here. And it's a series of essays that explore a couple different aspects of the maritime Underground Railroad all throughout the East Coast. It's a really good read. Definitely would recommend checking it out if you're interested in this a little bit further. And then also, if you're interested in, I know that this is kind of Boston centric, but through the Park Service, we did during the pandemic a website that explores all aspects of the Underground Railroad in Boston. And it's a series of maps and to everyone, series of maps articles, story maps, a couple videos. It's really in depth, looking at the Underground Railroad in the city. I'm sorry, Robert, you're muted.
That's okay. And now we're flooded with questions here. I have a lot of things going on around me, Shawn, so I'm muting
All good, no
myself and I'm
worries, no
forgetting
worries
to
at
unmute.
all.
I'm sorry. So Christine wants to know, do you know if any boats were associated with Salem? So were any of the
Um,
boats used associated with Salem?
so I don't have any off the top of my head, but I would imagine that there probably would be. Just because I do know that Salem did have a strong anti-slavery community. There were a lot of connections to Boston. It would not surprise me. But as far as direct examples and sources, I'd have to do more research into that.
To what extent did abolitionists who helped people escape slavery overlap with those whose activities led to the Civil War?
I would say they pretty much go hand in hand. I think the fugitive slave law itself is actually one of the most galvanizing laws that really pushes people to have a stronger opinion about, the institution of slavery right here in the North. And the reason why you're getting things like the fugitive slave law is you have that driving effort of the anti-slavery activists that are keeping it, on people's minds, aiding people escaping, which eventually would get that law passed. And I'd say that kind of, keeping the feet to the fire a little bit is definitely something that is going to lead closer to the Civil War.
Claudia says, I've heard about ships being used by escaped slaves, but no one seems to talk or write much about it. Why do you think that's the case?
It's a good question. You know, I think it kind of it looks at how and who gets remembered and what stories get shared. And, I think one of the most, I always ask the question on my tours when I say the term Underground Railroad, what comes to mind? People, places, or events. And I'd say probably 95% of the time, the first answer I get is Harriet Tubman, right? And people think and associate, and rightfully so, Harriet Tubman with the Underground Railroad. But it kind of speaks to that more sensationalized narrative of like sneaking into the South and taking people from the South and bringing them north. I think in a combination of that, as well as a lot of narratives in history that gets remembered, especially written about the anti-slavery movement following the Civil War, the heroes that get elevated as anti-slavery leaders are often white. Are often individuals like a Wendell Phillips, Charles Sumner, not necessarily as much of a William Lloyd Garrison, but it's then, Levi Coffin, people who are operating these safe houses. And it's the myth of the Underground Railroad that kind of takes hold. And I think that because of that, some aspects of the Maritime Underground Railroad are lost because it's easy to kind of fit more into this neat narrative of, you're following the North Star, the other, symbols and mythology associated with it. So I think it's kind of how history is written, how it is retold, and then certain things might kind of go by the wayside.
Gotcha. I think Kirk's comment, I think book recommendation is actually the one that you shared. Justine has a question about, and again, I think we don't have a great idea in terms of numbers because, as Shawn said, it was considered an illegal activity. Karen's question: Do you have recommendations for sources to validate or invalidate where were real Underground Railroad stops?
Yep. So if you go to that link that I shared, we do have a map that identifies Underground Railroad safe houses in Boston. So you can look up addresses. We often have pictures of the sites. So that's a good way to identify specifically in Boston. Now, if you're looking for kind of outside, Boston, there is a group called the Network to Freedom. And the Network to Freedom is part of the Park Service, but it is not tied to one site because it looks at Underground Railroad sites confirmed all throughout the country. And here is the link to the Network to Freedom. So if you go there, they have a couple different things.
Great. Let's see. Were there any black ship captains who assisted enslaved people escaping? So that was from Abigail.
Um, I would say specifically in Boston, I don't have any examples of it. And again, I kind of focused it on Boston. I see that some people are putting Robert Smalls in the chat, which I think is a great example because, maybe not necessarily a ship captain in the sense of official title, but he masqueraded as one when he stole the Confederate gunner, the blockade runner called the Planter, which he then was able, through his knowledge of the harbor, navigate through a series of checkpoints run by Confederate soldiers, and then eventually turn the ship over to the Union Army, and he brought enslaved people with him. So that's a wonderful story that is definitely worth looking up. I know that Austin Bierce is going to work hand in hand with like Lewis Hayden, who's not necessarily captain of the ship, but he's able to get on board and help people escape. So I'd have to do a little bit more digging kind of outside of Boston to see if there are any specific black ship captains that were involved in this effort. But the Maritime Underground Railroad was an interracial effort for sure.
Claudia asks, clarification, what was used to smoke out a ship?
So basically what people would do, as far as my understanding of it, was to burn tobacco or like sulfur. Basically just like have a controlled burn on the ship to fill the ship with smoke. Obviously not light the ship on fire, but smoke it where, almost like, I don't know how good of an example, but like a smoking meat, right? Where you have like coals, it's smoking, it's not necessarily like burning anything, but it is smoking and filling the ship with smoke to the point that it would be very hard to breathe.
All right, so Shawn, now I'm going to jump over to the Q&A. Carol Ann asks, what was the final destinations for boats carrying slaves to freedom?
So it kind of depended, there's examples of New Bedford, Boston, really kind of like up and down the East Coast where you have like more prominent anti-slavery communities. So it's not necessarily like one specific destination, because often what would happen is someone who was enslaved might learn there's a ship that's going to one of these cities. I'm going to sneak on board this ship rather than a ship that's like grabbing everyone, taking them north. Because oftentimes you're not going to get like a ton of people trying to get on board. You might get like one or two people that are going to sneak on board, less likely to be caught or noticed. So it kind of depended on whichever port the ship was going to.
Not sure you can answer this one, but Mary Jo asks, do you have any statistics about how many people did not make it to safety in comparison of those that maybe did? Want to get a sense of just how significant it was for those who made it to safety.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have specific statistics about how many people have been captured. I think it's also kind of thinking about how many, there were plenty of escapes that never even got off the ground, right? Where like there's plots, people are betrayed, cold feet, whatever you say. There's a lot of deterrents obviously put in place to try to prevent this. In fact, Frederick Douglass himself actually had his first escape attempt kind of foiled before it even happened. So he ended up, instead of going with a group, he went by himself. I can say that historians do estimate that roughly like 10,000 to 100,000 people successfully escaped. And I would say that if I were to give an educated guess, that there were many more attempts that failed than were successful. I know that's not an exact answer, but I would say that, yeah, there was more failure than success for sure.
Kristen wants to know, what were the consequences of any women caught helping free slaves? What if they were parents with children? What if the children themselves were helping to free the slaves? What were the consequences for people helping free slaves?
So you have instances of people being jailed, fined, you know, physically punished and abused. So Lewis Hayden escapes, and the woman who helps him escape, there's two people, Delia Webster and Calvin Fairbank. Delia Webster spent some time in a prison. Calvin Fairbank will actually be sentenced to 15 years for 5 each enslaved. Now, punishments might be lighter for women in the 19th century, but you know, they are very much still going to be punished. And you know, face some of those severe consequences.
Barb asks, when freedmen and women moved to Canada, was there support, education, jobs, and an accepting community waiting for them?
There were some, you know, communities that kind of became predominantly African American, that there were also support systems created to try to help those individuals when they arrived in cities and spaces where, you know, looking for jobs, looking for work, looking for, you know, kind of that general community feel. There absolutely were in Canada.
Carol asks, can you tell us more about Spectacle Island as a tourist spot? I never knew there was a hotel there. Would George have reached out to someone on the island to help him?
Great question. My guess is he would not have, just based on probably wanting to try to get out of there as quick as possible. But Spectacle Island is just like a brief background. It has kind of gone through a bunch of different iterations. It was a horse rendering plant, and then it also became a landfill. And definitely was a part of the contribution to Boston Harbor being really disgusting. But what they did was actually, interestingly enough, Spectacle Island now is a recreation area. They capped the landfill with a lot of dirt from the Big Dig. So putting the high, you know, Interstate 93 underground, where the Rose Kennedy Greenway is now. They used a lot of that dirt, brought it out to Spectacle Island, capped the landfill, and then were able to turn it into this recreation space. Where today there's a swimming beach, there's 2 drumlins, so kind of like, you know, hills, if you will, you can walk up to the top of, a lot of hiking trails, and you know, some great kind of recreation as well as solitude and good birding up there if anybody's into that too. So a lot of different cool stuff to do out on Spectacle Island today.
We'll take a few more questions. Sandy asks, how did people along the route plan and communicate with one another to provide places in an age without any kind of electronic communication?
Great question, right? And I think there's a huge kind of leap of faith, putting your fate into someone else's hands where you're trusting complete strangers that you do not know. But, you know, I think, again, kind of going back to what I said earlier, there's going to be loose networks of people that can reach out to another person, right? If you come to Boston, there's going to be a community in that North Slope of Beacon Hill that's welcoming. And then there's like the Liberator office, you know, that's a site on the Underground Railroad where William Lloyd Garrison ran his newspaper out of, you know, had a stash of things, good stuff that can be passed along to people who had escaped the institution of slavery. And then it's, you know, it's kind of knowing and having a contact in a neighborhood, in a city outside, right? So like there's a strong anti-slavery contingent in Worcester. Someone who arrives in Boston might be given a letter and say, get on this train at this time. I've already written ahead. This person's going to meet you there. Again, you don't know what that person necessarily looks like besides a written or a verbal description. So there's just a lot of inherent sense of trust, faith, belief, and obviously risk in order to try to make something like this work. There's some symbols and things like that, but you know, I think some of the symbology of the Underground Railroad is a little bit more mythologized than, you know, may have been the reality.
So Sharon wants to know, where are you located, Shawn? And Karen wants to know, do you personally give Freedom Trail tours? I'd love to take a tour with you, and I loved your presentations.
Great. Thank you both very much. So I'm located at Faneuil Hall. I'm actually in the Faneuil Hall basement right now. This is one of where our offices are. We do Freedom Trail tours as well as Black Heritage Trail tours in the summertime. We'll start those up around Memorial Day, and then they're free to go on. You can just you just have to register for them online at our website. The registration isn't live yet, but it will be in probably a couple of months.
Claudia says, excellent presentation, and she gives you many thanks. I think we have time for one more question. An anonymous attendee asks, was commerce at the ports affected by the Civil War, or did business still occur? And were enslaved people still escaping at this time?
Yeah, so commerce was definitely affected because the United States government essentially creates a blockade around southern states to try to stop the South from exporting cotton or anything else, really, to try to prevent things from coming in too. So it's really at a standstill. Now, as far as enslaved individuals escaping, things did get a little bit easier when the war came because of the chaos of the war, and it allowed for now the Union Army, if it's in, say, Missouri, Mississippi, Georgia, it gives an opportunity where instead of trying to get to a free state, you can get to the army that's kind of representing the free states. And in fact, you actually had what becomes known as the contraband laws before the Emancipation Proclamation, which essentially said that enslaved individuals that escaped Union lines were contrabands of war. The idea being that the Confederacy was using enslaved people to aid their war effort. Therefore, if enslaved people arrived to Northern lines, they could be taken and, as seen as taking away things from the Confederacy. This is prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, when the Lincoln administration's official policy was still not emancipation. It was bringing the Union back together, crushing the rebellion.
So Karen says, thanks. Yeah. So Karen says, thanks so much for a great presentation. Amy says, wonderful presentation. Judy says, thank you so much. So I think we'll wrap it there as we approach 1:30. Shawn, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up?
I appreciate y'all taking the time out of your day.
Yeah. So folks, let's give Shawn one big last virtual round of applause. And for those watching live, look for an email for me tomorrow morning with a link to the feedback survey, a link to the recording, and information about some other upcoming programs that might be of interest. Next month, we'll be looking at the Lowell National Historical Park. So very much looking forward to that. So I hope everyone enjoyed the talk, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Shawn.
Thank you.